I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm standing in front of Fort Moultrie, which is a very famous Revolutionary War fort. It has some great history in and of itself, but it's not Fort Moultrie that I want to talk about today. You can see Charleston Harbor, the city of Charleston there behind me. That's the fort, though, I want to talk about today. Right there, you can see the American flag flying over it. That is Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. And it's here where the first shot of the American Civil War was fired. And it makes sense that the first shot would be here, actually, because the purpose of Fort Sumter was to collect federal taxes. Okay, there were defensive purposes as well, but this was where the import duties were collected. To Southerners, the tariff represented a tax on the South for the benefit of the North. So the way it worked was about 80%, close to 80% of all federal taxes ended up being paid for by the South. The South was mostly agricultural. After 1820, the North was much more industrial. And so the industrial base was in the North. If you're an agriculturalist, all of your manufactured goods must be purchased from elsewhere. And of course, where do Northerners want the Southerners to buy their stuff, their manufactured stuff? So they want them to buy in the North. So the Southerners have a choice. They can either buy Northern goods or they can buy foreign goods. And often the foreign goods are much cheaper. And so Northern business interests got together. And if you're interested in this subject, look up the Harrisburg Convention in the late 1820s, the Harrisburg Convention. Anyway, Northern business interests began to organize. In fact, this is where we see the first large-scale, really national lobbying efforts going on. They organized themselves and lobbied for a high tariff on imported goods. That way, Southerners would have to buy from Northerners instead of from, cheaper sources overseas. Then that money, this was Henry Clay's idea, all that tariff money, not only would it fund the government, not only would it protect Northern industry, but you could then use some of that revenue garnered through this tariff to improve, they called them internal improvements, improve roads, canals, and other enterprises like that, mostly though in the North, where the industry was. So from a Southern point of view, they're paying the vast bulk of the taxes, and the Northerners benefit. So for many Southerners, this is sort of like an economic rape of the South for the benefit of the North, and this has been going on for several decades. This is a major, major issue. Southerners found that even if they all voted as a bloc, even if every Southern state voted against a tariff, it could still pass. And so many Southerners are starting to feel like, this is reminiscent perhaps of what it was like in Revolutionary days, when even though they really have no representation in the government, even if they vote as a bloc, they could still lose. So the tariff was a big issue. And in Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address, he promised, and keep in mind that his inaugural address was given after several of the southern states, including South Carolina, where I am right now, had already seceded. He gets up and he says, look, we're going to hold and occupy the forts. We're going to hold and occupy the federal territories in the South, like Fort Sumter behind me. We're going to occupy those, and we're going to collect the taxes. So to many Southerners, that was a declaration of war. In order to instigate a war, though, in order to get the South to fire first, of course, no president wants to be seen as an aggressor. This is throughout American history. You can find example after example in war after war. There must be a spark. There must be a first shot, an incident that can allow the president to then pose as being on the defensive. No one wants to be seen as the aggressor, and Lincoln is no different. He does not want to be seen as the aggressor in a war against the South. They have to fire first. This tariff issue is important enough, as well as a sovereignty issue. I mean, Fort Sumter is in the South, which has seceded. It's its own country at this point. If he can get the South, these South Carolinians, to fire on Fort Sumter, that gives him the ability to pose not as the aggressor, but as being on the defensive. He knows, and we know he knew this, plenty of records that support this, He knew that by supplying Fort Sumter, he could get the South to fire upon it, and therefore get the South to be the ones to fire the first shot. They would be seen as the aggressors, he thought. And so, and this is a very complicated history. You can look at this history, you'll see that this is very muddy stuff, and it's controversial. There are a lot of scholars who would disagree with what I'm saying right now, and I disagree with what many scholars say. You be the judge. But in any case, supplying this fort was what was needed, and he knew that, to start hostilities, and that's indeed what he ultimately did. And there are a lot of factors that go into that, including electoral problems in the north and other things. At the end of the day, Northerners were not willing to let go of a revenue-producing South, and Fort Sumter provided a means to get the South to fire first. And so Lincoln did indeed attempt to supply Fort Sumter. The South did indeed fire first. Of course, no one died in that battle, but it was enough to get Lincoln the permission he needed to organize his 70,000-man army and invade the South, and thus began the war between the states, or the Civil War, so-called. It all started right here at Fort Sumter. When Northerners realized that they, who had just passed the Morrill Tariff, the highest tariff in American history, is almost a 50% tax on foreign goods, when they realized that the Morrill Tariff would create in the North a high tariff, highly protected, economically protected area. Meanwhile, the Southern Constitution had just come out in early March, creating what was almost a free trade zone in the South. Where are all the foreign goods going to come through? Are they going to come through the high protected northern ports? Or are they going to come through the free trade southern ports? They're going to come through the South. That turned a lot of people and a lot of northern opinion from, let's just let those southern states secede, no problem, to being militantly against secession. So these are sort of some of the issues that often don't even make it into the textbooks. And yet, these are key, these are central to understanding what the war was all about. And so Lincoln supplied Fort Sumter and got the South to fire, and the rest is history. Of course, midway through the war, the North is losing. We get Gettysburg, we get Vicksburg, we get the Emancipation Proclamation. The whole tone of the war changes. The whole purpose, supposedly, of the war changes. And then the victors write the books at the end, and now it's it's portrayed as a war about slavery. Don't forget Fort Sumter, though. Don't forget Lincoln's inaugural. Don't forget the tariff. It just may be that this is what the Civil War was all about.